Men of Dan, men of Asher, men of Reuben, listen to me today. You know me as Lightning, but my real name is Barak. Barak from Naphtali. Yes, I know there is no king in Israel, but still, why did you refuse to heed to my call to fight our oppressors? No, rather you all just continued doing what was right in your own eyes. Don't you remember? After that courageous act of Ehud, killing that fat king Eglon. Don't you remember the lefty killing the hefty? And how God delivered you from the Moabites. Oh, and don't you remember how Israel enjoyed 80 years of rest and freedom thereafter? In all this time, you should have been confirmed steadfastly in your faith, but rather it made you secure, and you indulged in your lusts. You turned your back on God, who delivered you, and started worshipping the idols of those who enslaved you. Can't you see the tragic, deplorable situation you get into when worshipping false gods? Doing this wicked thing, this evil thing in the sight of the Lord, provokes him and brings his wrath on you. Don't you realize this oppression you are in by Jabin is a result of your own disobedience? God has not forsaken you as you forsook him, and he is still working with you, disciplining you. Jabin, yes, that atrocious king of Hazor, that city of workmanship, cutting and carving stone and wood, that great timber district where Jabin oppressed you with forced labor, hewing wood and preparing it for his cities and his pagan temples. How terribly sad to think that Joshua had burned Hazor, but your fathers allowed the Canaanites to retrieve it again and to build it and to occupy it, turning it into their headquarters from where to oppress you. Through your sin, you had lost your advantage against the Canaanites. To be oppressed by those whom your fathers had conquered is so terribly grievous. And now, with his large army, his superior military might, and his 900 chariots of iron, Jabin and his wicked captain Sisera are securely in control of the land, causing havoc in your lives the past 20 years. And still, you preferred to worship the gods of your oppressors? Madness! Just look at your nation. All your major roads are constantly patrolled by the Canaanites with their chariots. Your highways virtually deserted. No more caravans of trade, no freedom of movement. You always have to travel on the back, winding sideways. There are no warriors in Israel, no army, no weapons. Villages are likewise abandoned because there are no walls to protect your people from being pillaged and robbed by the Canaanites. It took Israel 20 years of bondage before they decided to call out to the Lord. Sadly, not in repentance to forgive your sins, but merely to relieve your suffering and give you a better life. Oh, don't you remember how Deborah has been a mouthpiece of God to you all? how in the presence of your pagan enemies, she constantly reminded you of God's miraculous past deliverances of Israel, and how she pleaded with you to turn back to God again. God had raised up this courageous little bee, as she's known, in your midst. But you would not hearken to her prophetic messages from God. Yes, Deborah, this mother of Israel, who had to treat you like little children, an indictment against all of us for a lack of willing men to stand out for God and to take the lead. Deborah, the humble shade tree prophetess, who did not occupy an important office in Jerusalem. No, she just simply worked beneath the shade of a date palm tree up in the mountains of Ephraim. You all remember incidents where you took your disputes to this woman of extraordinary knowledge and wisdom and piety, and how she instructed you in divine knowledge by the Spirit of God, and how she interpreted God's will in all cases. Deborah, intimately acquainted with God, following him, serving the nation of Israel. But let me start at the beginning of the events that took place yesterday. Being from Naphtali, I live there close to Hazor, where the oppression of Jabin and Sisera was at its worst. In the past, I have had some recounters with the forces of the oppressor, gaining me a reputation of a rebel amongst my tribe. God has already spoken in my heart to resist these pagan Canaanite oppressors. And then, one day, out of the blue, I was summoned to the palm tree of Deborah. Giving me a message from God, she confirmed what God had already pressed upon my heart. And as you will well remember from my previous visit to you all, I was instructed by God to assemble and lead an Israelite army against Jabin and Sisera. It was clear that I had to gather troops from my own tribe. But even if all of them had enlisted, I felt it would just not be enough. We needed numbers. So I approached all of you, tribes of Dan, Asher, and Reuben, but you would not come. I feared no one would follow me in this battle. After all, the Israelites had been oppressed for 20 years by the Canaanites, who were well armed, and the Israelites virtually unarmed. I had to find a way of convincing more men to join me in the fight against Jabin. And who better to approach than Deborah, this trusted prophetess and the mother of all Israel? Many had been coming to Deborah for judgment. Israel looked up to her. They respected her, they trusted her, and they knew God was with her and had worked through her. Perhaps they would listen to her and follow her into battle with me. So I demanded Deborah to go with me to the battlefield. Yes, perhaps I trusted her relationship with God more than my own relationship with God. But I felt that her presence would be better to me than a council of war. I knew this was God's battle to fight, and I needed God's representative to be there with me, to direct me, to advise me in every difficult situation, and to lead me according to God's plan in battle. It It was a vital necessity to have God's presence and continual direction when going to battle. This would also have boosted the morale of the soldiers. However, Deborah proclaimed what seemed to be a riddle to me, that the glory of the victory would not be ascribed to me or to the army, but rather to a woman. And I immediately, obviously, expected this to be fulfilled by Deborah herself in some miraculous way. But this prophecy was fulfilled so unexpectedly, by such a sudden change and twist in events, which I will get to if you listen to me patiently. Men of Asher, men of Reuben, men of Dan. Anyway, fame and honor were not the elements that motivated me, but rather the presence and the honor and the glory of the God of Israel. I managed to enlist 10,000 men from my own tribe of Naphtali and also from the neighboring tribe of Zebulun. But even with this large number, I felt we did not stand a chance. Later, volunteers from the other tribes also joined, and the army grew to 40,000 men. Still not nearly enough soldiers to guarantee a victory. Humanly speaking, I was leading all these courageous, brave men to a sure death. But let me tell you what happened on the battlefield and what spectacle you have missed sitting there in your tents. The most ridiculous military plan ever was followed. When you consider that we scarcely had any weapons and that Israel had no trained standing army, challenging this technologically advanced military superpower like the Canaanites, simply suicidal. Through Deborah, God ordered me to muster the 10,000 troops on Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor, high above the plain of Esdraelon, with its broad top of nearly a mile in circumference, afforded us a strong position out of reach of Sisera's chariots. Now up in the safety of the mountains, I felt a bit secure, as the chariots could not reach us there. Oh, what a sight it was! If one could have seen the two armies setting out for battle, we hiding like rabbits in the mountain, and Sisera with his well-armed soldiers and 900 iron chariots. We set out with 20 years of defeat behind us, and Sisera with 20 years of military dominance over us. Sisera, accompanied by his top military strategists. Myself, accompanied by Deborah, wife of Lapidot, mother of Israel. What a contrast. Unexpectedly, the most remarkable order came through Deborah. And quite frankly, a battle plan that made absolutely no sense militarily speaking. A shock. I had to lead these 10,000 poorly armed men away from the safety of the mountain, down onto the plains where Sisera's army was waiting. This is precisely where the chariots had the most advantage and could do the most damage to us. The plan just didn't make any sense. We were so vulnerable, an open, easy target. On the plain, the chariots were the perfect weapon to quickly annihilate us completely. So we started moving down the mountain. And this lured Sisera to order all his chariots to engage in battle on the plain. Sisera's chariots had been his pride and his confidence. It looked like a slaughter was about to take place. Deborah urged me, and she said, "Spring into action, for this is the day the Lord is turning Sisera over to you. Has the Lord not gone out before thee? Has the Lord not taken the lead?" When God himself is the leader, who can hesitate to follow? So I decided to step out in faith and trust God's plan. I believed in God, in his saving power, and that he was ultimately in control, no matter what. So I boldly went down from Mount Tabor with the 10,000 men following me. We went down into the valley towards the plain, giving Sisera the opportunity of optimizing all his horses and chariots against us. Although this open plain made us completely vulnerable, it was the very place God wanted Sisera and his army to be. In full dependence on divine power, I admonished my men that in the Lord alone is the salvation of his people. The formidable Sisera, a celebrated general, bold and experienced, his chariots, his iron chariots, and his multitude of soldiers, they came charging down at full speed. The 900 chariots, each equipped with sharp hooked cutters fastened to their axle trees. They could simply drive right into our army of footmen, shredding us to pieces in the most terrible execution. God lured Sisera and his chariots closer toward the brook Kishon, closer to us. We were standing waiting. The only thing between us and certain death was this little brook Kishon, now almost completely dry. Now there were only a few moments left before they would reach us. I had absolutely no idea how God was going to work this out. No one could have thought how God has set a trap for the enemy. And then suddenly, there was a mighty sound of thunder. The heavens grew ominously dark. The sky was lit up with the most terrifying lightning that kept on striking all around. The Creator caused the stars to fight against Sisera from their courses. It seemed to me the stars were literally falling from the sky. The heavens and the elements fought for Israel against Sisera. The earth quaked, the skies poured, the clouds burst, and the mountains shook. The fierce tempests of rain and hail and thunder and lightnings that ensued caused such a tremendous panic in Sisera's army. Remember, this is the dry season. No one expected a single drop of rain. And remember, the Canaanites view their god Baal as the god of storms. And this sudden change of weather completely confused the superstitious Canaanites, who thought their own god Baal was now turning against them. Suddenly, the little brook Kishon was not dry anymore. The trickle in the brook turned into a mighty rushing river at an instant. It so suddenly overflowed with a flash flood, and the battlefield was turned into a sea of mud. The ground on the banks of the Kishon near Megiddo became an impassable morass. The water and mud so severely impeded the mobility of the Canaanite chariots and horses that they could not move an inch, not backwards, not forwards. The enemy was trapped. The muddy conditions made the chariots of iron an hindrance and not an help in battle. Kishon, now such a deep, strong stream of water and mud, drowned most of the enemy. Many of the chariots were swept away in front of our very eyes like dry little leaves. Along with a torrent that swept even the strongest of soldiers away, God sent confusion in the midst of the enemy troops. They were thrown into a deadly panic, which totally disabled them. Men, horses, and chariots were intermingled in a wild confusion. This made it very easy for us. Such an easy prey. And Deborah's words were made good. The Lord has delivered them into thy hand. So listen to me, you men of Asher, men of Reuben, men of Dan. God drew the enemy into a trap that he might deliver them into our hand. The obvious place of our destruction became God's place of wiping out Israel's enemy. And you were not there to witness God's mighty hand of power and salvation in action. You missed it all. The other 30,000 men of Israel joined us in a hot pursuit of the scattered forces, even to their headquarters at Harosheth. We spared none of them. There was not a man left. Everyone except Sisera, who seemed to have escaped. And he was the actual brains behind everything against Israel. And we simply had to get him somehow. How ironic. The Canaanites, who practiced astrology and looked to the stars for direction and help, found the stars fighting against them. The chariots they so trusted in became their downfall. Now, while the troops were busy with a mopping up operation, plundering the enemy's weapons, I was told that Sisera had escaped on foot towards Hazor for safety. You see, in Hazor, Sisera had an ally in Heber, the Canaanite, who was a distant descendant of Israel through Jethro, father-in-law of Moses. However, Heber before abandoned his relationship with Israel and he moved to the north and he allied himself with Jabin, the Canaanite king, who was oppressing Israel the past 20 years. Heber had changed sides, no longer on Israel's side, but on the Canaanite side. So there was peace between the people of Sisera and the people of Heber. 6 miles away from the battlefield, Sisera arrived at Heber's place. But only Heber's wife Jael was there, I was told. Jael invited Sisera into a tent, giving him milk, covering him with a blanket. And soon fatigue and sleep overcame Sisera for the last time, as he would never wake up again. Now it is here where the story takes an unexpected turn. Being a wise woman, Jael concluded that Sisera was fleeing the battlefield, which meant that the Jews had won the battle and that the Canaanite grip on the land was broken. What Sisera didn't know was that God had promised that a woman would take his life. Quite obviously, Jael's loyalties were no longer with the Canaanites, not the same as with her husband Heber. Her loyalty was to Israel. She refused to be bound by the covenant of peace that her husband had made with the Canaanites. She knew God gave Israel the right to possess this land in which they were now slaves. Her zeal was for the glory of God as against the gods of Canaan. As you well know, putting up tents and taking them down again is a woman's work. And Jael had the tools of her trade close at hand. And she knew how to swing a hammer. While Sisera was deep in sleep, she seized a tent peg and pounded it through Sisera's skull into the ground. By the time I arrived at the tents of Heber, Jael called me to her tent, showed me Sisera's body with the head still pinned into the ground. The glory did indeed go to a woman, as prophesied by Deborah. For a captain to flee a battle is embarrassing. For him to be killed while fleeing is truly humiliating. But to be killed by a woman is the most disgraceful thing of all. And this is how God humiliated this proud Sisera. So men of Israel, listen to me. God's judgments are a great deep. He judges sin. And the instruments of his execution this time was a nail of a tent. Sisera, that thought to destroy Israel with his iron chariots, himself now being destroyed with just one iron nail. So men of Asher, men of Reuben, men of Dan, listen now to me. It's not too late. This victory not only eliminated some of Jabin's top warriors, but it also deprived him of his greatest weapon, his 900 iron-rimmed chariots. We had also confiscated all their weapons. And this battle against Sisera was surely important, but it does not end here. The struggle has to carry on until we destroy Jabin, the king of Canaan. We will not be totally free. Men of Israel, the war is not over yet. We won this battle, and the defeat of Sisera and his army is a major turning point in our history. But I urge all of you to join in the fight so that we can grow stronger and prevail over this ever-weakening Canaanites. Turn to God, your deliverer, and worship him. We must completely destroy Jabin, king of Canaan, so that our descendants will hear no more of Canaanite domination. But men of Israel, the most important thing, it is not enough only to slay Sisera, but also to destroy his master Jabin. And so it's also not enough for us to rest, but to press on until idolatry is completely erased in Israel. Let us learn from this, and let us remember the lessons. God is in control of the nations of the world. God hates sin, and God punishes sin. And even though man is continually wicked, God is always merciful and forgiving. God is a savior, and his promises are true. If God be for us, who can be against us? Who?